Hi. This week you were asked to watch the movie adaptation of Terry Pratchett's Discworld novel, Hogfather. First, a little bit about Terry Pratchett. Sir Terry Pratchett was born in 1948, and he published his first speculative fiction novel in 1971. He would later go on to leave journalism and become a full-time writer, and he was phenomenally prolific and successful in that regard. It's demonstrated, especially his popularity in Britain, by the fact that he was knighted in 2009. Terry Pratchett is notable because even by the standards of fantasy writers in general, he's a little bit eccentric. He's famous for his love of fedoras. He has interests ranging from astronomy to apes. And after he was knighted, he actually forged his own sword using primitive methods and materials. With the possible exception of Lord Byron, he has the most devoted following of any writer we have or will read in this class, and is generally respected and admired in the speculative fiction community. There was a great deal of sadness when Terry Pratchett announced that he'd been diagnosed with Alzheimer's a few years ago. And despite a grim prognosis, he's maintained a really inspiring attitude towards life. As of the time of this lecture, he was still at work writing. Pratchett, incidentally, has a brief cameo in the film as the toy maker, which I feel is kind of an interesting choice of roles. My own first experience with Terry Pratchett's writing was his collaboration with Neil Gaiman, which I mentioned in this week's lecture, Good Omens. Good Omens is a satire of this sort of genre of movies, the biblical apocalyptic movie. They were very much in vogue at the time, and if you've never seen the original Omen, you're really missing out. These types of movies invariably told the story of the Antichrist sort of rise to power. The Antichrist is generally assisted by supernatural forces and sort of a vast conspiracy. The premise of Good Omens is that there's a mix-up, and the Antichrist is placed, instead of with this sort of evil family, with an absolutely average sort of suburban home. But he's still got like sort of terrible, awe-inspiring powers, and he's also accompanied by a hellhound. Meanwhile, there's this average kid that the conspiracy and all the supernatural forces think is the Antichrist, and doesn't really fit in with that sort of agenda. It's a really terrific book, and it's very, very funny. I can't really recommend it strongly enough. Pratchett's Discworld series began with the book The Color of Magic, which was also later dramatized. Pratchett's writing often combines humorous allusions, anachronisms, wordplay, and slapstick to satirize his subject. The Discworld, which the series takes its name from, for example, traces back to a probably apocryphal story set in ancient India. There's a teacher and a student, and they're sort of discussing the world. And the student asks the teacher, well, what does the world sit on? What's holding the world up? And the teacher tells him that the world is a disc that sits on the back of elephants. Okay? So the student asks, well, what are the elephants standing on? And the teacher replies, well, they're standing on the back of a giant turtle. And so the student asks, well, what's the turtle standing on? And the teacher says, well, that's enough. We're done. If you're paying attention, there are all sorts of like these sort of jokes throughout the movie, throughout his novels. And the Discworld itself contains all these references to sort of these cliches of fantasy worlds, often with a comedic flair. You have the capricious supernatural forces, you have warring guilds, you have city watches, you have magicians' colleges, and so forth. But despite its comedic aspects, Hogfather actually conceals a number of deeper philosophical messages. Death, who is unexpectedly fond of humans, even if he really doesn't understand them too well, opposes the auditor's strictly deterministic plans to eliminate the Discworld's equivalent of Santa, the Hogfather. Like our own Santa, the Hogfather is a figure that has evolved considerably over the ages, and his return to primitive origins epitomizes his function as a symbol of hope and imagination and belief and all sorts of other qualities the auditors find inconvenient. It's worth noting that as strange as the notion that Santa Claus could be anything other than a merry old fat toy giver, um, it isn't the first film or even the most recent film to sort of exploit this premise. And if you're interested in an alternate take on Santa, I would like to recommend the 2010 Finnish film called Rare Exports, which is a kind of a apocalyptic fantasy slash comedy whose premise revolves around a billionaire's ill-advised plan to extract the original Santa from his icy grave. I'm going to warn you that if you like Christmas and you like Santa, you might want to skip this one. I can guarantee you'll never look at Santa's little helpers the same way after you watch it. It's also worth noting that the idea that hope can be killed, specifically using uh, children's belief in sort of mythical figures, and particularly the idea of stealing teeth from the Tooth Fairy, was recently shamelessly borrowed by the film The Rise of the Guardians. But you really see in Hogfather a much more nuanced kind of approach to this subject. Death's intervention is often comedic, precisely because while he respects qualities like goodness and generosity, he doesn't really understand them too well. The characterization of death as a well-meaning spirit, really humanity's best hope, is an example of the situational humor that often elevates Pratchett's writing above that of other fantasy humorists. Similarly, the level to which he establishes the character of death, moving him beyond the mere personification of a principle, shows great talent. By far, the most nuanced character, however, is Susan. The opening scenes of the movie, her interpretation of fairy tales, her dealing with the monsters under the bed, are among my real favorite scenes in this movie. As Death's granddaughter, Susan enjoys a weird status in Discworld, and her rejection of the family business, despite her obvious talent for it, and her sort of growing acceptance and partial reconciliation with her grandfather during the film, show a level of character development seldom really explored in humorous fantasy. By saying all this, I'm not saying Hogfather isn't completely above cheap laughs, the oh god of hangovers, for instance. But it would be fair to say that Pratchett is a much more capable storyteller than many other humorous fantasists. On a final note, I should mention that much of Pratchett's humor is kind of lost on audiences who sort of didn't grow up watching British television, aren't familiar with sort of the British countryside and so forth, so on and so forth. I recently learned, for instance, that the same actor who voices Death also participates in a number of other very popular British shows. And Pratchett deliberately wrote his dialogue to sort of parody dialogue that he'd spoken in those other shows. There's all sorts of things going on in the background of Discworld, sort of what is called intertextual references. And the issue of intertextuality will be very important in the coming weeks when we start talking about the idea of postmodernism and postmodern fantasy. At any rate, thank you very much, and I will talk to you later.